Hey, what's going on, guys? UFC 296, Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington goes down in about a month on December 16th in Las Vegas. And while this card doesn't have the biggest names on the pay-per-view, this is one of the deepest UFC fight cards of 2023. I mean, it is stacked from top to bottom. There's a lot of incredible prelims. There's a lot of just great fights on this card. I mean, I don't know if there's been a deeper pay-per-view than UFC 296. So I want to discuss UFC 296. I'm going to go through some of the prelims, highlight some of the prelim fights, discuss the entire pay-per-view main card, and just discuss how good UFC 296 is. And I'm going to say two things about the main event later in the video that are a bit hypocritical, but you'll understand and I'll explain them when I get to that. But let's start off with the prelims. And I'm not going to go super in-depth with every single one of these fights, but just to highlight a couple prelims on this card. You have Andre Fili versus Lucas Almeida. I mean, that should be a banger. That's a solid matchup right there. You have Alonzo Menifield versus Dustin Jacoby. I mean, that's not the greatest fight of all time, but that's probably going to be somewhere around the early prelims. So that's a pretty solid light heavyweight fight right there. I mean, that's a excellent kickboxer in Dustin Jacoby against Alonzo Menifield, who has crazy power, decent wrestling, and just had those crazy fights with Jimmy Crute in his last two fights. But forget about those prelims for a second, because those are solid. But you also have Tagir Ulanbekov versus Cody Durden. That's a really, really good flyweight fight. And honestly, I'm really looking forward to that matchup. I think that's great matchmaking by the UFC. But the two prelims that I really want to highlight and talk about, I haven't even got to yet. So that just shows you how deep this card is. And while we're here, we might as well highlight the worst fight on the card, which is probably Casey O'Neill versus Ariane Lipski. And that's not even that bad. I mean, that's probably going to, I'm looking at these fights, it's probably going to open up the card. That's probably what's going to open up the card, because you have Randy Brown, Muslim Salihov. You have Irene Aldana, Carl Rosa. That's actually probably the worst fight on the card. So one of those two women's fights. But let's highlight the two really interesting prelims. The first one is Josh Emmett versus Giga Chikadze. I love this fight. I absolutely love this fight. You have Josh Emmett. He's lost his last two, but look who he's fought. Ilia Topuria and Yair Rodriguez. And you have Giga Chikadze, who had a lot of hype making his way up the featherweight ranks. I mean, he beat Edson Barboza. The hype went through the roof. And then Calvin Kattar beat him up, and that was all the way back in January of 2022. Since then, he's only had one fight. He fought Alex Caceres in August of this year. He won that fight. But he's never really been, tested outside of Calvin Kattar. And this is his opportunity. Giga Chikadze is not young. I believe he's 34 years old. He's 35 years old now. And he's going against Josh Emmett, who's still a pretty good talent. He's getting up there in age. He's 38 years old himself. And it's do or die for Giga Chikadze. And it's do or die for Josh Emmett. Because if Giga Chikadze loses this fight at 35 years old against old man Josh Emmett, which is no guarantee that he wins this fight, his title hopes are over. His title hopes are over. How's he going to build himself back? 2-3 years? He's going to become featherweight champion when he's 38 years old. It's not going to happen. And for Josh Emmett, I mean, his title hopes are pretty much already over. But on a 2-fight losing streak, 38 years old, got the brakes beat off him by Ilia Topuria, got destroyed by Yair Rodriguez, had the, option or the opportunity for the interim belt there. This is do or die for both guys. So not only is this a really high-level fight, you have Josh Emmett with good striking, nasty power, loads up on that right hand. You have Giga Chikadze, excellent kickboxing, has shown to be decently well-rounded, but had trouble dealing with Calvin Kattar's pressure and volume. This is do or die for both guys. It's a high-level fight. I'm really looking forward to that prelim. That's on the prelims. That would typically be on like a pay-per-view main card. That's how good that fight is. They're both ranked, I believe, in the top 10, but at bare minimum in the top 15. But then you have another prelim, and this is the last prelim that I'm going to highlight. You have Cody Garbrandt versus Brian Kelleher. Talk about do or die. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I've said this so many times for Cody Garbrandt. When they give him these layup fights, and granted, only one of these layup fights ever came to fruition, and he had trouble with Trevin Jones. It was his last fight. He got a win there, but by the skin of his teeth. Cody Garbrandt, a former bantamweight champion, and he's barely beating Trevin Jones, who borderline doesn't even belong in the UFC. I mean, it's just crazy when you look at all these losses. Knocked out by Kai Kara France, lost to Rob Font, beat Rafael Sunsao, but what does that really mean, especially considering how long ago it was? Before that, lost to Pedro Munoz by KO. 2 losses to TJ Dillashaw by KO. And when you get these types of layup fights, They tried to book him against Ronnie Yaya for the longest time. That got canceled so many times. Then they booked him against Trevin Jones. He gets the win there, but just barely by the skin of his teeth. He gets booked against Mario Batista. I think Garbrandt, I forgot what the injury was, but Garbrandt pulled out of that fight for some reason. Good on him, because Mario Batista would have smoked him bad. I don't trust the chin anymore, but he's had some more time off, and now he's fighting Brian Kelleher. The UFC clearly wants to build Cody Garbrandt back up. They looked at him when he won the title years ago against Dom Cruz, which is crazy. That was all the way back in 2016. December 2016, he won the title against Dom Cruz. The UFC thought Cody Garbrandt, they thought they were going to build him into a star. This is a bit of a weird comparison, but imagine the streak that Cody Garbrandt's gone on in the last couple of years. Imagine if that happened to Sean O'Malley after his big win over Aljamain Sterling. That's the closest comparison I can give you. They thought Cody Garbrandt is going to be this massive star. Not massive star, but they thought he was going to be a star. He was charismatic. He had a fan-friendly fight style. People liked watching him fight. He had finishes. And then, boom, loses his next 3 fights all by finish. Imagine if that happened to Sean O'Malley now. That's kind of the equivalent of what the Cody Garbrandt downfall. But they gave him Trevin Jones. He squeaked by in there. And now they're giving him Brian Kelleher, I believe he was cut by the UFC. He lost his last 2 fights, got finished by Mario Batista, got finished by Umar Nurmagomedov. He had a fight booked against Journey Newsom that got canceled for whatever reason. I don't know if he stepped in short notice there, but I swore he got cut from the organization. But for whatever reason, they brought him back, or he was never cut, and I'm mistaken, and I'm thinking of somebody else. This is a fight that Cody Garbrandt should win, but Brian Kelleher has decent power in his shots. And Cody Garbrandt, I don't trust his chin at all. So when you have one of these layup fights, it's great. You can get back on your feet. It's a tune-up fight. But if you lose, if he gets chinned by Brian Kelleher, it's over. It's over for Cody Garbrandt. At 32 years old, it would be over. So there's a lot riding on this fight. I think stylistically, it's a fun fight. Brian Kelleher always shows up to scrap. Cody Garbrandt always shows up to scrap. That's probably what cost him his chin over the years. But really looking forward to that prelim as well. But the prelim is just overall completely stacked. One of the deepest prelim cards of the entire year. I can't remember every single card off the top of my head, but these are probably the deepest prelims, highlighted by Josh Emmett versus Giga Chikadze and Cody Garbrandt versus Brian Kelleher. Now, moving on to the pay-per-view main card, we have some great fights on this card. First up, according to the current bout order, they might switch it around a little bit, but I'm sure all these fights will be on the pay-per-view main card. We have Vicente Luque versus Ian Machado Garry. This is a great fight. This is a great test for Ian Machado Garry. Vicente Luque, kind of been a top-ranked guy for a while. Had his loss to Jeff Neal, had his loss to Bilal Muhammad, came back against Rafael Dos Anjos earlier this year in August. Got a win there, but it wasn't like, it just seemed like Vicente Luque wasn't his typical self. But Vicente Luque, very good fighter, has great striking ability. His kind of weakness is his grappling, but he shows up to fight every single time. I mean, Vicente Luque's had some great fights. The Michael Chiesa fight ended quickly. The Tyron Woodley fight was great while it lasted, but also ended quickly. Vicente Luque has been in some great fights over the years. And Ian Machado Garry coming in undefeated, 13-0. This is a great kind of, stepping stone for Ian Garry's career. The UFC's kind of slowly creeping him up that ladder rather than throwing him right into the deep end. And I think this is perfect matchmaking. I think this is a fight where you get a test for Ian Garry, but it's not such a jump up the rankings where you're almost destined for failure. So I love this matchup. Honestly, I would have liked even a slighter more jump up for Ian Garry, but I love this fight. Ian Garry, we know he comes to fight as well. He's always, he's always moving forward. He's not even moving forward really, but he's always looking to strike, always looking to finish you. I didn't finish Neil Magny in his last fight, but I mean, what were the scorecards in that fight? What were the scorecards? I can't even remember. It was like 30-24. I think he 10-8'd him 2 rounds, maybe even 3 rounds. It was just brutally chopping his legs. It was a beating of Neil Magny. And Neil Magny, I know he's kind of a gatekeeper for the top 15, but still, nonetheless, for Ian Garry to go out there and make him look the way that he did, I thought was pretty impressive. I know people were saying, oh, he didn't finish him. He literally brutalized him for 3 rounds. It wasn't even close, so I still think it's a solid win. But outside of that, it's a win over Daniel Rodriguez. Daniel Rodriguez isn't that good. He's a decent stepping stone, to kind of make that way into the top 15. But outside of that, you're looking at Kenan Song, Gabe Green, Darian Weeks, Jordan Williams, which he actually had trouble with in his UFC debut, was getting clipped up. And in some of these fights, he had trouble. Song caught him as well. So against Vicente Luque, those mistakes that Ian Garry could get away with in the past, he might not be able to get away with against a guy like Vicente Luque. So just a really solid welterweight matchup. Whoever wins this fight is going to be maybe 1 or 2 fights away from contender status, or not even contender status, really number 1 contender status in the welterweight division, because whoever wins this fight is going to shoot up the rankings, probably going to be around somewhere between like 5 and 6, somewhere around there in the rankings, maybe even a little bit lower, but they're going to be like 1 win away, 2 wins away max from a potential welterweight title shot. So I love that fight. Moving up the card to a fight that I have a love-hate relationship with, and that is Tony Ferguson versus Paddy Pimblett. I don't know if I've seen a fight in a matchup that can have the highest of highs but the lowest of lows depending on this outcome. I don't know if there's more of an emotional roller coaster ride that we can get than Tony Ferguson versus Paddy Pimblett, because Tony Ferguson is one of the most beloved fighters in the UFC, and it honestly hurts me. Being a Tony Ferguson fan, I've created my own prison. Watching Tony Ferguson fight into 2023, honestly, it's my sacrifice, because Tony Ferguson is on a 6-fight losing streak. He got finished by Bobby Green in his last fight. Bobby Green, okay, I know that loss hasn't aged that badly considering it was competitive, but Bobby Green just recently knocked out Grant Dawson. Fight before that, got submitted by Nate Diaz, who's out of his prime. Fight before that, got front kicked, got punted by Michael Chandler. Fight before that, dominated by Dariush. Fight before that, dominated by Oliveira. Fight before that, had his soul taken by Gaethje in an interim lightweight title fight. Has there been a worse fall off than Tony Ferguson? And then you got Paddy Pimblett, who's like the UFC's hand-picked golden child, who they're gonna try to hype up this fight if he does win. They're gonna be, oh, he beat Tony, he's a former champ, and blah blah blah. But I mean, he robbed Jarrett Gordon in his last fight. He robbed Jarrett Gordon. He should have lost to Jarrett Gordon. It was pretty clear. And Paddy Pimblett's one of the most disliked fighters in the UFC, I would say. Maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement, but I think a lot of people don't really like Paddy Pimblett. So it's like you have this fight where if Tony Ferguson wins, the elation and the joy from the MMA community, because not only do you have a beloved fighter, one of the most beloved fighters, you have one of the most disliked fighters, and you have a guy who's on a losing slope, and it's been sad for everyone to watch. I mean, can you imagine if Tony Ferguson pulls this off? I hate this fight because seeing Tony lose to Paddy Pimblett is going to hurt. It's going to hurt. I mean, it's going to be, I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine. I'm going to be, 6 feet from the edge if Tony Ferguson loses to Paddy Pimblett. So it's one of those fights. It can be the highest of highs. It can be the lowest of lows. It's not a super high level fight anymore because Tony Ferguson, obviously, he's not the same guy he once was. Paddy Pimblett, I don't think he's ever going to go that far unless he vastly improves. But nonetheless, I mean, this is a matchup. People talk about, trash talk and they want to care about a fight. They want to deeply care about a fight. And I'm not a big fan of trash talk. I just prefer seeing the best versus the best. I prefer meritocracy in terms of title shots. But this is a fight that I can kind of get up for. Because if Tony pulls this off, it'll be the best night ever. I don't care if I get every pick on the card entirely wrong. But if Tony gets it done, oh my goodness, I will be so happy. It will be unbelievable. So I'm really looking forward to that fight in a weird, sick, twisted way. All right, moving up on the card to the featured fight on the card, we have Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson in the welterweight division. I love this fight. This is a fight I've wanted to see for a bit. Wonderboy basically being held at gunpoint to fight Shavkat Rakhmonov. He tried to duck Shavkat badly. He wanted nothing to do with this fight. I mean, Wonderboy was like ready to retire rather than fight Shavkat Rakhmonov. But his last fight got canceled against Michel Pereira. Then he expected to get paid when he turned down the fight because of the weight miss from Michel Pereira. The UFC wasn't happy that he turned it down considering they were giving him favorable matchups. He only wanted to fight strikers and he was ranked in the top 10. He's turning down fights against grapplers, openly saying, I don't want to fight grapplers. But then he turns down the fight against Michel Pereira, and I said it right then. I said, look, Wonderboy will only be offered guys like Shavkat Rakhmonov and Rinat Fakhretdinov from here on out. There's no way the UFC is going to give him a favorable matchup because whether you agree with Wonderboy's decision or not, I knew the UFC wasn't going to be happy about it, okay? And that's what they did. They told him, take it or leave it. We're going to keep offering you Shavkat Rakhmonov. So Wonderboy had to take it. We can give him a little bit of credit for taking this fight, but at the end of the day, I mean, he's being held at gunpoint. he's being forced, to fight Shavkat Rakhmonov. But I love this fight because as much as people say, oh, you hate Wonderboy, you criticize Wonderboy too much, Wonderboy's still a very good fighter. I was one of the very few that picked him. I thought he would easily beat Kevin Holland. I thought he would outstrike Kevin Holland, and I think I even picked him by finish against Kevin Holland, but I might be wrong on that. So Wonderboy still has something to give, and he has elite level striking, and on top of that, he has some of the most aesthetically pleasing striking in the entire UFC. And then you have Shavkat Rakhmonov, who may be one of my favorite fighters in the UFC. I'm trying to think right now. He's probably top 5. 17-0 in his MMA career. All finishes, 8 wins by KO, TKO, 9 wins by submission. Coming off one of the best fights of the year against Jeff Neal, where he got a standing rear naked choke with no hooks in. And Jeff Neal's a very good fighter. I think he's actually underrated. At one point in time, people were talking about Jeff Neal as a future champion. But now he's fighting Wonderboy Thompson, who's a different test. The striking of Wonderboy is really, really solid. I'm assuming Wonderboy over the last few years has been working on his grappling. Before Kevin Holland got out-grappled by Bilal Muhammad. Before that, got out-grappled by Gilbert Burns. Before that, has a win over Jeff Neal. So this is going to be an interesting fight. I'm assuming Shavkat's going to mix in the grappling. But I wonder, does Shavkat keep it on the feet for a while? How do those exchanges go? This is a banger matchup for the welterweight division. And if Shavkat beats Wonderboy, I think he's one fight away from a title shot, or you could maybe even give him a title shot. I know the Wonderboy Thompson win isn't that great, and Bilal Muhammad obviously deserves a title shot more than Shavkat, especially right now. But a win there, and then let's say Bilal gets the next title shot, Shavkat's rightfully next in line after that. But for Wonderboy Thompson, if he beats Shavkat, he shuts up a lot of the haters. He shuts up a lot of the people who criticized him for turning down the fight because he went out there and beat a guy who a lot of people were expecting as a future champion. So this is a fight that's kind of do or die for both guys, because if Shavkat loses to Wonderboy, it's not the end of the world, but it definitely douses some water, on the hype train of Shavkat Rakhmonov. But for Wonderboy, this could be his career resurgence. If he beats Shavkat, he's right back in the mix. 1-2 fights away from a potential title shot, probably one fight away, depending on how the division plays out. But I'm very curious to see how this fight plays out in terms of on the feet. If they just strike for a bit, is the threat of the takedown from Shavkat going to be too much for Wonderboy? Is Shavkat going to shoot right away? Can Shavkat run through Wonderboy? Because even if you expect Shavkat to win, and I think, a lot of people are expecting Shavkat to beat Wonderboy, not necessarily run through him, but maybe finish him. If he goes out there and let's say he runs through him in the first round, that would be something that would be super impressive. Say what you will about Wonderboy, but when's he been finished in the first round? I don't know if he's ever been finished in the first round. I'm looking back. I don't know if he's ever been. He got finished in the second round against Anthony Pettis, and that was kind of a lucky shot, brutal KO shot. But if Shavkat goes out there and beats Wonderboy in an impressive fashion, he's right up there in the mix for the title. Okay, the co-main event, we have the UFC flyweight title, Alexandre Pantoja versus Brandon Royval II. This is a banger. I know there's a lot of casuals out there, or not even casuals, but even some kind of like in between casual and hardcore that don't really like the flyweights. This is the people's main event right here. Alexandre Pantoja versus Brandon Royval is a straight up banger. In a meritocracy type universe, this is the main event. There is, in the list of some of the most exciting fighters on the roster, you have Alexandre Pantoja and Brandon Royval. I've talked about it for a while. Brandon Royval is probably my favorite flyweight in the UFC. He's so scrappy. He's so exciting. He's so well-rounded. They have, the back history between the two guys where Pantoja beat him back in 2021, finished him, but that was a fun fight up until that point. And now you have Brandon Royval, who's kind of, earned his way back. He's on a 3-fight not a losing streak. He's on a 3-fight winning streak. Went out there, nasty KO over Mateus Nicolau in his last fight. Before that, finished Matt Schnell. Before that, beat Rogerio Bontorin. Then you have Pantoja, who has looked incredible in his last few fights. Beats Manel Kape, beats Brandon Royval, beats Alex Perez, beats Brandon Moreno. So, he's on a 4-fight winning streak, looked incredible. The Brandon Moreno fight was incredible. That was one of the best fights. That might be the best fight of the year. That gets underappreciated because it's a flyweight fight. So you have these two guys who fought not that long ago, but still it's, almost 3 years ago at this point. What month was that? So it was 2021. So basically about 2.5 years, or close to 2.5 years. I think they both leveled up. I think they both improved vastly. And I think this should be a straight up banger. Pantoja goes out there, looks to create chaos, to potentially grab your back or grab some type of grappling dominance and look to rip your head off, look to rip your arm off, look to rip your leg off. Also, his stamina has improved. His striking has improved. Brandon Royval, nasty finishing ability. I mean, look at the knee that he landed in his last fight to get that nasty KO. So this co-main event for the flyweight fight, in a universe where we're basing it off meritocracy and excitement, and like trying to play it up to the fans, these guys are underappreciated. Pantoja and Royval are underappreciated. Two of the most exciting fighters in the UFC who really have no name recognition outside of really the hardcore fans know who they are. So this is a straight up banger. And I know, like, as a main event of a pay-per-view, it wouldn't sell, because, it's, two flyweights who people barely know. But still, straight up banger. Really looking forward to that co-main event. I mean, I think no matter what happens in that fight will be incredibly exciting. Okay, now moving on to the main event. We have Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington for the welterweight title. Now, I'm kind of mixed on this fight. And I've already had my critiques of this title fight. I've talked about it in countless videos ad nauseum. But I'll quickly say, I'll get out what I dislike about this fight. I hate that it's an unjustified title shot for Colby Covington. He's been hiding in witness protection for 2 years. He's 2-2 in his last 4. Doesn't have any wins over current ranked fighters. And he's getting the title shot, okay? But let's forget about that. Forget about the title fight, the undeserved aspect of it. This is still a very good matchup. This is still a very good fight. And while it's a great fight, it's one of those matchups where it could end up being a snoozer, but it could end up being amazing because Colby Covington just marches forward, throws volume, and looks for takedowns, And I know some people think it's boring, but I don't particularly, I've talked before, there's people who think, Khabib Nurmagomedov's boring, but they think Colby's exciting. For me, I think Colby's decently exciting. I don't think he's the most exciting fighter on the roster, but I think his style, I like to see how guys try to address it and stuff those takedowns and look to strike with them and how they look on the feet, dealing with that constant pressure. So I think this is one of those fights. It could end up being a snoozer, but it could be very fun. And also, Colby could walk into a shot against Leon Edwards. Leon Edwards coming in off of 2 wins over Kamaru Usman. That crazy KO Hail Mary in the 5th round, last minute. I mean, that's insanity. So even though I kind of hate this fight for the undeserved aspect of it, it's still a really good fight. And both guys, I've talked about Colby being an undeserved contender. I've never said Colby's a bad fighter. I've never said Colby doesn't have a chance. I even picked him in my early prediction. I'm kind of leaning Leon Edwards now, in case you're wondering. But this is a matchup that could go either way. I think it's 2 high-level fighters, and I think it's a very compelling matchup because you have striker versus grappler. But Leon Edwards has fought one of the best grapplers in the division against Kamaru Usman in his last 2 fights. So I'm very curious to see the improvements that he's kind of gained in this camp and how he puts it against Colby Covington, who kind of has a different wrestling style than Kamaru Usman. But with all that being said, and I was going to make a separate video on this, but I'll say this in this video as well, and I'll just leave it at this. I kind of hope this fight gets canceled. Now I know I've said it's a good fight, so it's kind of hypocritical to say, well, Joe, you just got done kind of hyping it up. How can you say you don't care if you want it to get canceled? I only want it to get canceled if we can get a replacement. If we can get Shavkat on 3 weeks, if we can get Bilal on 3 weeks. I don't love the short notice aspect of it, so after 3 weeks, I don't want to cancel. If we get down to 2 weeks, I don't want to cancel. But for me, I love when the UFC goes more towards the meritocracy. I know there's a gray area. I know it's not always based on a meritocracy, but I would love, we're about 4 weeks out right now. We're about a month away. I would love if one of these guys pulled out, even if it was Leon Edwards, to be quite honest. I know that sounds crazy because of the welterweight division and it hasn't been moving on for the last 8 months, but I would love to see Bilal versus Colby Covington. I actually think that's the bigger fight. I would love to see Shavkat versus Colby Covington. I would love to see Edwards versus Muhammad too. I know people are going to say, oh, you're crazy, Joey. How would you want to see that? I think it'd be a compelling fight. I think both guys have improved vastly since their first fight that we never got to see the finality of. I would love to see Leon versus Shavkat. I mean, Shavkat is probably, top 5 most exciting fighters in the UFC. So even though I still think this is a good fight, and I don't want it to happen when it gets closer to the fight, I would love to see one of these guys pull out. I don't want him to get injured. I'm not wishing injury on anyone. In the grand scheme of things, all I want to see is the welterweight division move on. I wanted to see it continue. And I just, seeing Leon or Colby, if they win, Leon's already talking about moving up to middleweight. Colby's already calling out lightweight champion, I made a video about the Leon Edwards stuff. If you want to check it out, I'll link it in the description as well as the end cards. But overall, I mean, if you somehow had a point system for this card and you really started adding up the compelling matchups and how skilled a lot of these fighters on the card are, this is one of the deepest cards of 2023. And off the top of my head, I'll go out on a limb and say, even though this doesn't have that kind of crazy headliner that you're looking for, like a John Jones versus Tom Aspinall, or, you know, Sean Strickland versus Hamzat Chimaev, or one of these massive, you know, really compelling, huge pay-per-views. Because of that, they stacked the card. They said, you know what, we're going to stack this card and make it really deep. And the talent pool on UFC 296, praying to the MMA gods, nobody falls out. Okay, I'm praying to the MMA gods, nobody falls out. Outside of maybe the main event, roughly in the next week. Otherwise, I wanted to stay together. I don't want to see someone having to take the title shot on 2 weeks' notice or a week's notice. I wanted to stay together if it gets any closer to the fight card. But let me know what you guys think of this fight card down in the comments. As we get closer, obviously, I'll be doing a bunch more content on UFC 296. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.